House GOP representatives want to take a new approach to countering the Chinese Communist Party. This as Republicans plan to unveil their midterm agenda in 10 days. Here are the details.
You might own the White House, but you no longer will own the People's House.
Predicting the GOP will reclaim the majority in the November midterms, House Republicans say they want to bring real changes to America's policies on China.
When we get the majority back, we're going to prepare America to win the great power competition against China.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans led a press conference in Texas on Thursday. They vowed to enforce sanctions on Chinese slave labor, block China's influence on American universities, and crack down on Beijing's espionage in the U.S.
Not through talk, but through actions and words and deeds.
Democrats have also stepped up their message of countering China. Following a trip by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan in August, a slew of bipartisan delegations has visited the democratically ruled island. The latest one traveled there on Thursday.
Is a symbol of Congress's rock-solid commitment to Taiwan.
The Biden administration is also hailing its efforts to compete with China, including the passage of the bipartisan CHIPS Act.
And China is trying to move away ahead of us. It's no wonder the Chinese Communist Party actively lobbied U.S. business against this bill.
Despite that, the House GOP says the administration has not stood up to the communist regime.
And as a result, today, China continues to steal America's intellectual property with impunity.
And on September 19, McCarthy is expected to unveil the GOP's midterm platform, which will cover the economy, the border, parental rights, and government accountability.
As we just told you, House Republican leadership held a rare joint press conference off of Capitol Hill. Leader Kevin McCarthy and several other members introduced a bill intended to crack down on the Chinese Communist Party. And here to discuss, we're happy to have with us Congressman Ralph Norman. South Carolina Congressman Ralph Norman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Congressman, a group of your colleagues today, including Leader McCarthy, introduced the Countering Communist China Act, legislation aimed at cracking down on the Chinese Communist Party as well as their espionage activities. Is this long overdue in your opinion?
Steve, it really is. You know, I got involved 3 or 4 years ago on the Confucius Institute, pointing out that this was just another way for China to steal our intellectual properties and do it on the dime of the American taxpayer. What this bill does, it puts new sanctions on China, on Chinese companies that steal our intellectual properties. It prohibits universities from receiving grant money from the NSF, National Science Foundation, that works with China, and it prohibits companies from, using our federal dollars to expand businesses in China. They're no friend of the United States, Steve. This should have happened long ago. I have no confidence that Schumer's bill, which is general in nature, it costs $250 billion as opposed to $1 billion on this, and his Endless Frontier Act is vague at best and has no teeth to it. This one does.
Congressman, does the fact that the CCP allowed the virus to spread outside of China while at the same time locking down inside of China, resulting in what we see now, we see the carnage, do you think this is something the CCP still needs to pay for? And if so, will Republicans, if they take Congress, hold them to account?
I really think we will. This is, where can you kill 1 million Americans and not have any consequences on it? There's been a silencing of those who have even questioned the virus. And, in my mind and in most people, this is a biological weapon used by a communist country that is no friend of the United States. And look at the carnage it continues to do with the drugs. The virus is one thing, but the fentanyl that's coming across the border now, the cartels, it's a carnage that this country should not put up with. And this administration has we've seen nothing that they would do to hold them accountable. So that's why we'll do this. I think when leadership changes, and we will win in November, we're going to put forth not only bills, we'll put forth subpoenas and trying to get to the bottom of it.
You bring up fentanyl in the southern border. It's the fentanyl's originating in China and making its way in. We're seeing also a record number of people illegally crossing the southern border this year that have died. What could a fresh Congress do to address this situation?
Well, I mean, look at the numbers. They don't lie, Steve. 748 migrants have died on the southern border so far this year, as opposed to in 2020, we saw 247 deaths. And I think 2021, like 300. But the bottom line is people are dying because of this administration's deliberate policies to open the border up. 60% of the Border Patrol agents are now just processing the fact that processing papers for them to come into this country, not stop them. And the only way you're going to stop them is build a wall and have a designated point of entry with this, which this administration simply will not do.
Congressman Norman, yesterday you introduced a bill banning federal funds for abortion travel expenses. Are taxpayer funds really being used for such things right now?
Absolutely. And that's why I wrote, we had about 37 co-sponsors on my letter to the 8 companies, major companies, Bank of America, Citibank, Citicorp, and others who their individual companies are paying for abortions for their employees. And but my bill will propose to stop any federal dollars that go to paying for travel expenses for abortions. And, the Supreme Court was right in sending it back to the states and basically banning Roe v. Wade and the effects of it. So, this is a top priority in my mind, and I think in the American people's mind.
You mentioned 36 co-sponsors. Is this an issue resonating with the people of South Carolina as well? Absolutely.
South Carolina has had a bill that's been stopped in the courts for a number of years. Now they're taking it back up to, it was 6 weeks. I think the most current bill alters that and has some different things in it. But yeah, South Carolinians are opposed to abortion, particularly infanticide that the left is promoting. And so South Carolinians are well aware of what's going on. And, for the countries we're one of the few countries that even allow this in any event. And it's high time that it's taken up by the states.
Congressman Ralph Norman, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
President Biden's new clean energy advisor, John Podesta, could have ties with the Chinese Communist Party. It's according to an investigation by the Daily Caller. They found that Podesta has cooperated with the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, or CUSEF, since 2009. CUSEF is registered as a Chinese agent in the U.S. under the Foreign Agents Registration Act and is backed by the CCP. According to the group's annual reports, Podesta sits on the group's U.S.-China 2022 Steering Committee. He has also written 3 articles for the group's website since 2011. The chairman of the CUSEF is also chair of a CCP agency in China known as the Political Consultative Conference. During the evacuation of Afghanistan just over a year ago, the United States brought nearly 80,000 Afghan citizens into the U.S., but not all of them were vetted properly. According to a recent report, the Department of Homeland Security encountered obstacles screening the evacuees and could have allowed people who pose a national security threat into the United States. The Office of Inspector General conducted an audit to determine the extent to which the DHS vetted the evacuees. They found that identification information such as name, date of birth, and travel document data was often missing or inaccurate. They also determined that Customs and Border Protection let evacuees who were not fully vetted into the U.S. The talk of Marxism and fascism is increasingly becoming part of the political dialogue in the United States. But are the two ideologies actually one and the same, with all roads ultimately leading to communism? To analyze, we have host of Counterpunch on Epoch TV, Trevor Loudon. Trevor Loudon, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Trevor, you've been warning of the Marxist underpinnings in Western society for a long time. Many of these things have actually come to fruition, critical race theory being one example. Where is the Marxist movement, if you will, in terms of influence? In what areas of society does this ideology have the most influence on that has you concerned?
I think it's the extensive infiltration of mainstream politics, the military, the judiciary system, the bureaucracy. Look, it's in most things. It's in the churches. It's in the so-called LGBTQ movement is a Marxist movement. So it's in Hollywood. It's in TV. But the one that's really most concerning now, the aspect, is the deep penetration of the government, the organs of state, the CIA, the FBI, the military, the Justice Department. And basically, I say we're in a revolution. What we're seeing now is what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1948, when the communists entered a coalition government and they took over the security services, they took over the military, I believe, and they used and the Justice Department, I think, and they used those to suppress their enemies, to come after their enemies, to shut them down. And it took them 3 years to establish a full communist state. And we're about 18 months through that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Trevor, recently we've been hearing the Biden administration refer to Trump supporters as semi-fascists. What do you think when you hear that comparison?
Well, who calls conservatives fascists? Stalin started that. That's a communist meme. The typical glance. So somebody calls a normal conservative or an American patriot a fascist, you can pretty much put a ring around it. They're a communist. That's what they're doing. That's their standard modus operandi. So that's Marxist talk. That's revolutionary talk. He is making an enemy. He's going to demonize that enemy, and he's going to crack down on that enemy, because that enemy is all that's standing between him and a complete monopoly on power. When I say him, I mean the forces behind him, because I really don't think he's that lucid.
In essence, how is fascism actually tied to communism or vice versa?
Well, look, back in the 1930s, there wasn't a lot of difference. Stalin wrote of his admiration for Hitler. Hitler wrote of his admiration for Stalin. They were both collectivist systems. The state is everything. And the slight difference was that the fascists were more national socialists, and some of them had an anti-Semitic bent, though Mussolini didn't. That was German fascism, not Italian fascism. But they were, and we've got to remember, Mussolini was the editor of the Italian socialist newspaper before he became a fascist. So in those days, there wasn't much distinction drawn between fascism and communism. They were brothers. They were like two branches of the mafia. Sometimes they'd work together, sometimes they'd have a bit of a fight, but they were essentially on the same page. It was Stalin, only really became a serious rift when Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. And then it was all on. Then all the, up until that time, American communists were supporting the Nazis. American communists and British communists were supporting the Nazis. French communists helped sabotage the French military so the Nazis could invade France. They were all together. It was only when they had a falling out that we had this differentiation between communism and fascism, which is a very superficial definition separation at best.
Trevor Loudon, thank you. The Pentagon has stopped accepting deliveries of F-35 fighter jets. The F-35 is one of the most powerful fighter jets in the world, but one of the parts being used in its engine was discovered to be made in China. Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of the jets, released a statement saying that, quote, out of abundance of caution, there is a temporary pause on all deliveries of the aircraft. The company has already found an alternative part for the engine.